The high collar of her uniform was choking her, but it was the accusation that truly stole Rosen's breath. She stood in the center of the Vane Estate's golden ballroom, her dark hands trembling as a billionaire pointed a finger at her chest, screaming thief. She was seconds away from a prison cell, until the heavy oak doors groaned open. Kwang Liu stepped out of the shadows, his eyes like polished obsidian and a velvet box in his hand, looking less like a guest and more like a judge at an execution. The mist in Ethelgard didn't just roll in from the Atlantic, it crawled. It was a thick, salt-heavy shroud that swallowed the jagged cliffs and clung to the wrought iron gates of the mansions lining the shore. To the wealthy elite who lived behind those gates, the fog was a charming aesthetic, a backdrop for their evening galas. But to Rosen Gold, the mist was a cold, damp weight that settled in her lungs and never truly left. It was 7:58 p.m., and the Vane Estate was vibrating with the frantic energy of the Gala of Lights. Rosen stood in the servants' corridor, adjusting the stiff, high collar of her white blouse. The fabric was cheap and starched so heavily it felt like fine-grit sandpaper against her neck. She checked her reflection in a small, cracked mirror, the only one in the staff quarters. Her skin, a deep, rich dark tone, looked luminous even in the dim light, and she had meticulously styled her black hair into a textured updo that was both elegant and strictly professional. Her dark brown eyes, however, told a different story. They were tired. They were the eyes of a woman who had spent 14 hours on her feet, starting at 5 a.m. with a stack of linguistics textbooks and ending with a mop bucket. 2 years ago, Rosen had been the star of her university's linguistics department, a polyglot who could navigate the nuances of Mandarin, French, and Korean with the grace of a diplomat. She had dreamt of a life in the city, translating treaties and bridging worlds. But dreams are expensive, and grief is a thief. When her father passed and her mother's medical bills began to pile up like a mountain of debt, those dreams were traded for a navy blue maid's dress and a brass name tag. Now, she was a ghost. In Ethelgard, the rich hide their sins behind oak doors, and the poor are expected to be the shadows that clean them. She moved into the grand foyer, her footsteps silent on the marble. The grandfather clock struck 8, and the first of the guests began to arrive, a parade of silk, diamonds, and indifference. She watched them through the lens of a student, identifying the accents of old money and the sharp, clipped tones of the nouveau riche. They looked right through her, their gazes sliding off her uniform as if she were part of the wallpaper. The pressure of the night was higher than usual. The Vane family was hosting this gala to unveil the Star of the Orient, a diamond so massive it was rumored to be the family's last tether to financial survival. Rosen could feel the desperation in the air, a sharp, metallic tang beneath the scent of expensive lilies. She knew the Vanes were crumbling, she had seen the overdrawn notices in the trash and heard the hushed, angry whispers between the ears. She stood at the edge of the ballroom, a silver tray of champagne balanced on her fingertips. Her knuckles were raw from the morning scrubbing, a stinging reminder of her reality. She was a woman who understood the power of words, yet she was condemned to a life of silence. But in Ethelgard, silence is a vantage point. Because Rosen Gold was invisible, she saw everything. She saw the nervous sweat on the nephew's brow. She saw the way the security guards, stoic men in black suits, watched the guests more than the diamond. And she saw the man who stood alone in the shadows of the arched doorway, a man with side-parted black hair and eyes like polished obsidian. Rosen didn't know his name yet, but she knew his energy. He wasn't a guest, he was a storm waiting to happen. Little did she know, by the time the clock struck midnight, she would no longer be a ghost. She would be the only witness to a crime that would change her life forever, and the only woman the Korean Mafia boss would ever deign to protect. The silver tray felt like it weighed 50 pounds by the time the clock struck 9. Rosen Gold moved through the Vane Estate's ballroom, a sea of rustling silk and sharp laughter that seemed to swallow the sound of her own footsteps. Her breath was shallow, caught in the tight, high collar of her uniform, but her eyes remained sharp, cataloging every detail of the Gala of Lights. She wasn't just delivering champagne, she was navigating a minefield. To these people, she was part of the furniture, as silent as the marble statues lining the hall and just as invisible. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying metallic tang of desperation. Rosen watched the Vane family patriarch laughing too loudly, his fair skin flushed with wine, while his eyes darted nervously toward the heavy oak doors. She saw the subtle cracks in the family's perfect facade, the frayed edge of a designer sleeve, the hushed, angry whispers between the ears in the shadows of the velvet curtains. This was a house built on secrets, and tonight, those secrets felt heavy enough to bring the ceiling down. Her knuckles were still raw from the morning scrubbing, a stinging reminder of the world she was stuck in. Every time a guest looked through her, she felt a surge of that moral rigidity her mother had taught her, the pride of an honest woman in a room full of frauds. She was a top-tier linguistics student, a woman who understood the nuances of 4 different languages, yet here she was reduced to a nod and a tray. She needed this job to keep the lights on in a small room 3 towns away where her mother waited for medicine she couldn't afford, but the weight of the injustice was becoming harder to carry than the silver. As she retreated toward the back gallery to escape the suffocating heat of the gala, the lights suddenly flickered. A sharp, rhythmic scratching sound echoed from the private study, the sound of metal against metal. Rosen froze. It wasn't the sound of a guest losing their way, it was the sound of a lock being forced. Her instinct told her to run to the kitchen, to remain the ghost she was paid to be. But the linguistics student in her, the one trained to find the truth in the noise, wouldn't let her move. She leaned toward the sliver of light at the study door. Inside, a man she recognized, the estate's own fair-skinned nephew, was hunched over a safe, his hands trembling as he pulled out a small black velvet box. The star of the Orient glinted even in the shadows. Rosen gasped, the sound barely a whisper, but in the silent gallery, it sounded like a gunshot. Before she could turn to flee, a shadow taller and colder than the rest detached itself from the wall behind her. A heavy, gloved hand didn't grab her, but instead rested firmly on the doorframe, blocking her exit. A low, calm voice with a slight accent vibrated in the air just inches from her ear. A witness is a heavy thing to be, Rosen Gold. Especially when the world is already looking for someone to blame. 3 days before the Star of the Orient vanished, the Ethelgard's sun had actually managed to pierce through the coastal fog, turning the Vane Estate's manicured gardens into a temporary sanctuary. Rosen sat on a weathered stone bench near the servants' entrance, her only refuge during a strictly timed 20-minute lunch break. She held a plastic container of cold rice and seasoned vegetables, a humble meal prepared with the precision of someone who had to make every grain count. Her mind was miles away, mentally conjugating irregular verbs for a linguistics exam she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to afford to take. She wasn't alone for long. A shadow stretched across the gravel path, and a man approached with a gait that was neither hurried nor hesitant. He was dressed in a formal black suit that looked far too expensive for a casual stroll, his black hair groomed with a sharp, side-parted precision that caught the midday light. As he sat at the far end of her bench, Rosen didn't see a billionaire or a legend, she saw a man who looked as weary of the world as she was. His dark eyes were fixed on the horizon with an intense, stern expression, his brow slightly furrowed as if he were solving a complex equation in his head. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence was comfortable, a rare commodity in a house that usually echoed with the shrill demands of the elite. Rosen noticed he hadn't brought any food. He simply sat there, his hands, long-fingered and steady, resting on his knees. Her moral rigidity tugged at her, she couldn't sit here and eat while someone else went hungry, even if that person looked like he could buy the entire garden. "It isn't a 5-star meal," Rosen said softly, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter of nerves. She held out the container toward him, offering a clean wooden spoon she always kept as a spare. "But the seasoning is right. My mother says good food is the only thing that makes a long day shorter." The man turned his head slowly. His gaze was piercing, dark brown and incredibly observant, as if he were reading the history written in the calluses on her hands. For a moment, she thought he might take offense at a maid's audacity. Instead, a ghost of a smile, so faint it was almost a trick of the light, softened his stern features. He took the spoon with a small, respectful nod. Your mother is a wise woman, he replied, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried a subtle, melodic weight. He took a single, polite bite, chewing thoughtfully before handing the container back. And you are far too generous for someone who works for the Vanes. Generosity in this house is usually a transaction. What is your price, Rosen Gold? Rosen blinked, startled that he knew her name, though her brass name tag was pinned clearly to her navy dress. Common courtesy doesn't have a price tag, she countered, her chin lifting slightly. If it did, only people like the Vanes could afford it. He let out a short, dry sound, not quite a laugh, but an acknowledgement of her wit. He stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket, the intense, accusatory look returning to his eyes, though this time it wasn't aimed at her. He looked at the mansion as if it were a puzzle he was about to dismantle. Remember that, he said, looking back at her one last time. Courtesy is a rare shield. You may need it sooner than you think. He walked away toward the main gates, leaving Rosen alone with her half-eaten lunch and a growing sense of unease. She watched him go, wondering who the stranger in the garden really was, unaware that the man who had just shared her rice held the keys to the very cage she was trapped in. The memory of his warning felt like a cold breeze against her neck 3 days later, as the same man now stood in the dark gallery, his hand blocking her escape while the sound of a theft echoed from the room beyond. I told you it was dangerous to see too much, Kwang Liu whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Now, you have a choice, you can scream, or you can watch how a real thief is caught. Before she could answer, the door to the study creaked open. The study door creaked open, and Rosen's breath caught in her throat like a stone. The nephew stepped out, his fair skin pale in the dim gallery light, the small black velvet box clutched against his chest like a prayer. His eyes were wild, darting left and right, but he didn't see them, not at first. Kwang Liu's hand remained firmly on the doorframe, a silent wall between Rosen and discovery, but his body was angled in such a way that they were both hidden in the deep shadow of the archway. Rosen felt the heat of Kwang's presence behind her, close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was unnervingly calm, a sharp contrast to the frantic energy radiating from the thief just feet away. The nephew took 3 hurried steps toward the servants' staircase, then stopped. He fumbled with the box, his hands shaking so badly that the clasp slipped twice before he managed to open it. The Star of the Orient caught the moonlight streaming through the gallery window, throwing fractured rainbows across the marble floor. Rosen's instinct screamed at her to run, to call for help, to do anything but stand frozen in the shadow of a man she barely knew. But Kwang's voice, low and steady, anchored her in place. Don't move, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. And don't make a sound. He needs to believe he's succeeded. Why? Rosen hissed back, her voice barely audible. If you know he's stealing it, why let him? Because a thief who thinks he's won will lead us to the person who hired him, Kwang interrupted, his dark brown eyes never leaving the nephew's retreating figure. And I have a very strong suspicion that the person who wants this diamond to disappear is the same person who owns this house. Rosen's mind raced, connecting the dots with the same precision she used to decode irregular verbs. The overdrawn notices. The whispered arguments between the heirs. The way the Vane patriarch had been sweating through his expensive suit all evening. Arthur Vane, she breathed. He's trying to steal from himself. Kwang's hand shifted from the doorframe to her shoulder, not a grip, but a steadying touch. Clever girl, he murmured. Insurance fraud is a profitable business when you're drowning in debt. But it only works if someone else takes the blame. The nephew disappeared down the servants' staircase, and the gallery fell into a suffocating silence. Kwang finally stepped back, releasing Rosen from the shadow. She turned to face him, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. They're going to blame me, aren't they? She said, her voice trembling. I'm the only one who was back here. I'm the perfect scapegoat, Kwang finished, his expression turning cold and stern. Yes. That was always the plan. A desperate maid with a sick mother and mounting bills? The tabloids would have their villain before the police even filed the report. Rosen felt the weight of the trap closing around her like the high collar of her uniform, tight, suffocating, inevitable. She looked down at her raw, scrubbed hands, the hands of a woman who had spent months cleaning up after people who wouldn't even learn her name. "Then why are you here?" she demanded, her moral rigidity flaring even in the face of danger. "If you knew this was going to happen, why didn't you stop it before?" "Because I needed proof," Kwang said, pulling a sleek, obsidian-colored phone from his jacket. He tapped the screen, and Rosen saw a grainy but unmistakable video feed, the nephew hunched over the safe, the diamond glinting in his trembling hands. "And now I have it." He pocketed the phone and looked at her with an intensity that made her feel like he was reading every line of her history, every exhausted hour, every sacrifice she'd made to keep the lights on in a small room 3 towns away. "Here's what's going to happen, Rosen Gold," Kwang said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant baritone that felt like a command and a promise all at once. "You're going to walk back into that ballroom. You're going to serve champagne and smile at the people who look through you. And when they accuse you, and they will, you're going to let them." "Let them?" Rosen's voice cracked with disbelief. "You want me to just stand there and—" "Trust me," Kwang interrupted, stepping closer. He was taller than her, his presence overwhelming, but there was something in his dark eyes that wasn't a threat, it was a vow. "I didn't share your rice in the garden to watch you take the fall for a Vane. When the moment comes, I will make sure the right person pays. But you need to play the part of the invisible maid for just a little longer." Rosen wanted to argue, to tell him that she didn't trust criminals, even the ones who claimed to be on her side. But she thought of her mother in the hospital bed, of the textbooks she still hadn't finished, of the life she was trying so desperately to build from the scraps she was given. "How do I know you won't just let them arrest me to protect yourself?" she asked, her chin lifting in defiance. Kwang reached into his pocket again, but this time he pulled out something small and metallic, a business card, matte black with silver lettering in both English and Korean. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers lingering for just a moment against her raw knuckles. "Because," he said, a ghost of a dangerous smile touching his stern features, "I don't protect myself, Rosen. I protect the things I decide are worth keeping." Before she could respond, the distant sound of champagne glasses clinking echoed from the ballroom. The gala was reaching its crescendo. Kwang stepped back into the shadows, his dark suit blending seamlessly with the gallery's gloom. "Go," he commanded. "And when the lights go out, remember, you're not alone." Rosen clutched the business card, her heart hammering, and forced her legs to carry her back toward the golden light of the ballroom. She didn't know if she was walking toward salvation or damnation, but for the first time in months, she wasn't walking as a ghost. She was walking as a witness. And in Ethelgard, witnesses were the most dangerous people of all. The ballroom felt suffocating after the cold silence of the gallery. Rosen slipped back into the flow of the gala of lights, her navy uniform blending seamlessly with the background as guests swirled past in silk and diamonds, oblivious to the theft that had just taken place mere feet away. As Rosen glided through the ballroom, the weight of the stranger's warning hummed in the back of her mind like a low-frequency alarm. The evening reached its crescendo when the Vane family patriarch, his fair skin flushed with a mixture of vintage wine and visible nerves, signaled for silence. He stood beneath the crystal chandelier, his voice booming with a forced joviality as he announced the unveiling of the Star of the Orient. The room went dark, save for a single, sharp spotlight focused on a velvet-lined pedestal. But when the glass casing was lifted, the collective gasp of the elite wasn't one of admiration, it was of pure horror. The pedestal was empty. The diamond, a stone said to be worth more than the estate itself, had vanished into the humid, salt-heavy night. Pandemonium erupted with clinical precision. The music cut out, replaced by the heavy thud of the mansion's security gates locking into place. Rosen felt the air turn cold as the lights flickered back to a harsh, unforgiving brightness. She stood near the buffet line, her dark hands clasped firmly in front of her navy dress, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew the geography of this house better than anyone, and she knew that in a room full of silk and diamonds, the woman in the maid's uniform was the only one who didn't belong. Nobody leaves, the fair-skinned nephew shouted, stepping into the center of the room. His face, which Rosen had seen hunched over the safe only moments prior, was now a mask of righteous indignation. He didn't look at the guests, his eyes scanned the perimeter of the room, skipping over the billionaires and the heiresses until they landed squarely on Rosen. The intense, accusatory fire in his gaze was unmistakable. "I saw her," the nephew lied, his voice echoing with a practiced tremor as he pointed a trembling finger at Rosen. "I saw the maid hovering near the study just before the toast. She was the only one back there." The room turned as one. The distressed and anxious expression on Rosen's face wasn't a confession of guilt, but a reaction to the sheer weight of 100 pairs of eyes judging her in an instant. She clutched her shirt in a defensive gesture, her brow furrowed as she looked for a single friendly face in the sea of scowling strangers. The estate's security guards, East Asian men in stoic black suits, began to close the circle around her. Rosen opened her mouth to speak, to tell them about the shadow she'd seen in the gallery and the metallic scraping of the safe, but her voice died in her throat. She realized then that the trap hadn't just been set, it had been built around her for weeks. The nephew stepped closer, a cruel smirk playing at the edges of his mouth as he prepared to demand a search of her quarters. Just as the first guard reached for her arm, a low, resonant baritone sliced through the chaos from the back of the room. "A very convincing performance," the voice said, dripping with a cold, refined boredom. "But you've chosen the wrong witness to lie about." Kwang Liu stepped from the shadows of the arched doorway, his black suit perfectly tailored and his side-parted hair unmoved by the tension in the room. He didn't look at the guards, he looked directly at the nephew, his dark eyes holding the weight of a man who already knew how the story ended. The ballroom, once a stage for celebration, had transformed into a courtroom of cold stone and sharp glares. The Vane Estate's security guards, stoic men with East Asian features and black hair, did not move to help Rosen. Instead, they stood like iron pillars, their presence physically focused on containing the perceived threat. The fair-skinned nephew stepped forward, his face a mask of faux betrayal as he demanded the head of security begin a search of the servants' quarters. Kwang Liu did not rush his approach. He moved with a predatory grace, his dark brown eyes locked onto the nephew with an intensity that made the younger man's confident smirk begin to falter. The crowd parted for Kwang like a dark sea. He didn't look at the empty pedestal, he looked at the star of the Orient-shaped hole in the room's integrity. "You seem very certain for a man who was allegedly dancing in the ballroom when the lights went out," Kwang said, his voice a calm, resonant blade that sliced through the nephew's protests. He adjusted his black necktie with a slow, deliberate motion, his expression stern and accusatory. I have witnesses," the nephew stammered, his fair skin turning a blotchy red. The maid was the only one with access to the back gallery. "It's obvious. She's desperate, her family is in debt, everyone knows it." Rosen stood frozen, her hands still clutching her shirt in a defensive gesture. Her mind raced in 4 languages, but the injustice of the moment made her tongue feel like lead. She looked at Kwang, the stranger in the garden who had shared her rice, and for a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of the man from the stone bench. But here, in the light of the gala, he was different, he was the apex predator in a room full of scavengers. "The problem with obvious answers," Kwang remarked, turning his gaze toward the lead security guard, "is that they are usually manufactured for the unobservant." He gestured toward the guards, who shifted their stance ever so slightly, not toward Rosen, but toward the perimeter of the room, blocking the exits. The atmosphere shifted from an interrogation of a maid to a lockdown of the elite. Kwang turned to Rosen, his expression softening by a fraction of a degree. "Tell them, Rosen Gold. Tell them what you heard in the gallery. Not as a servant, but as a witness." Rosen swallowed hard, her furrowed brow smoothing as she found her voice. "I heard metal scraping," she said, her voice gaining strength as she looked the nephew in the eye. "Not a key. A forced entry. And I saw a shadow wearing a ring that caught the moonlight. A ring I've seen on your hand every time I've served you coffee." The nephew let out a jagged, nervous laugh. "Her word against mine?" A maid's fantasies against the word of a Vane? Kwang Liu reached into the inner pocket of his tailored blazer. The room held its breath. He didn't pull out a weapon, he pulled out a small, high-tech device that hummed with a soft blue light. In my world, Kwang said, his dark eyes turning cold enough to freeze the champagne in the glasses, we don't rely on words. We rely on the things people think they've hidden. As the device began to project a grainy but undeniable video feed onto the ballroom wall, the nephew's face went from red to a ghostly, defeated white. The blue light from the device flickered against the nephew's pale skin, but he wasn't ready to surrender. Digital trickery, he spat, his voice cracking as he looked toward the fair-skinned patriarch. You're going to trust a stranger's gadget over your own blood? The maid is the one who was in the hall. She probably hid it on her person when she saw the guards coming. The nephew took a frantic step toward Rosen, his eyes wild and intense. In the confusion, he stumbled, his hand accidentally brushing against the pocket of Rosen's navy servant's dress. It was a move so quick only a trained eye could catch it, a desperate sleight of hand to plant the evidence he still carried. Search her, he screamed, retreating with a triumphant look. If she's so innocent, why is she shaking? Search her pockets right now. Rosen felt a sudden, heavy weight in her apron pocket that hadn't been there a second ago. Her heart plummeted. She looked at Kwang Liu, her brow furrowing in a distressed and anxious expression. She knew if she reached in and pulled out that diamond, the video wouldn't matter, the truth would be whatever the loudest person in the room said it was. The lead guard, a man with black hair and a stern expression, stepped forward. But instead of reaching for Rosen's pocket, he stopped and looked at Kwang. The Korean Mafia boss didn't look worried. He looked amused, a dark, dangerous glint in his brown eyes. Go ahead, Rosen, Kwang said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. Show them what's in your pocket. Rosen's hand trembled as she reached into the fabric. Her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. She pulled it out, and the room gasped. But it wasn't the Star of the Orient. It was a handful of common glass pebbles from the garden path, the same path where she had shared her lunch with Kwang. The nephew's jaw dropped. He fumbled at his own jacket pocket, his fair face turning a ghostly shade of white as he realized his own pocket was now empty. Looking for this? Kwang asked, holding up the small black velvet box between two fingers. My men are very good at redistributing items when they see someone being clumsy. The nephew turned to run, but the guards, his supposed allies, instantly blocked the path, their expressions stoic and physically focused as they moved to restrain him. The police are already at the gates, Kwang said, his voice turning cold. But they aren't here for the maid. As the guards forced the detained man into the center of the room, his expression falling into a somber and defeated gaze, Kwang turned his back on the elite and looked at Rosen. Now, he whispered, comes the part where we discuss your new salary. The siren wails from the front gates of the estate finally cut through the heavy silence of the ballroom. The Vane patriarch tried to step forward, his face pale and sweating, but the lead guard, one of Kwang's men, simply placed a firm, gloved hand on his chest, a silent command that the era of Vane authority had ended. Kwang Liu turned his back on the family, his dark brown eyes focusing solely on Rosen. He looked at her not as a maid, but as a woman who had stood her ground when a room full of billionaires tried to crush her. He reached out and gently took the glass pebbles from her trembling hand, replacing them with a crisp, linen handkerchief. You have a habit of being too honest for your own good, Rosen Gold, Kwang said, his voice dropping to a private, resonant baritone. I don't know how to be anything else, Rosen replied, her voice still shaky as she looked at the nephew being led away in handcuffs. But why? Why go through all this for a maid you met once on a bench? Kwang's expression remained stern, but there was a flicker of something almost human in his gaze. Ethelgard is full of people who take things that don't belong to them. Diamonds. Dignity. Lives. It is rare to find someone who offers what little they have to a stranger for no reason at all. The local police chief entered the room, looking confused as he saw the elite family members being restrained by Kwang's stoic guards. He moved toward Kwang with a mix of respect and fear, aware of the man's reputation in the underworld. "Mr. Liu, we have the report, but we'll need the witness to come to the station for a statement," the chief said, gesturing toward Rosen. Kwang Liu stepped between them, his presence an immovable wall of black silk. "The witness is under my protection now," he stated, the words carrying the weight of a decree. "She will provide her statement from my office. And you will ensure her mother is moved to the St. Jude Medical Wing by morning. Consider it a down payment on her new contract." Rosen looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with shock. She had spent her life trying to be invisible to avoid the shadows, only to realize she was now standing in the center of the largest shadow in the country. "I don't work for people like you," she whispered, her moral rigidity flaring one last time. Kwang Liu actually leaned in, a sharp, knowing glint in his eyes as he gestured to the ballroom full of disgraced elite. "You've spent years working for respectable thieves, Rosen. Perhaps it's time you tried working for an honest criminal." As he turned to lead her toward the waiting black sedan, a loud, crashing sound erupted from the kitchen, a sound of breaking porcelain and a high-pitched, panicked shout. The tension in the grand foyer was so thick it felt like it might shatter, but the silence was suddenly punctuated by a sound that didn't belong in a mafia confrontation. From the direction of the industrial kitchen, there was a massive clatter, followed by the distinct sound of a silver tray spinning on marble like a dying coin. Kwang Liu's lead guard, the one who had been holding the Vane patriarch with terrifying, stoic efficiency, suddenly winced. A young man with a black suit and a very crooked necktie tumbled through the swinging doors, clutching a stack of hors d'oeuvre napkins as if they were a shield. This was Han, Kwang's junior assistant, whose job was to maintain the intimidating atmosphere, but whose coordination was famously lacking. "Sir. The perimeter is, whoa." Han yelped, his shoe slipping on a stray piece of gourmet ham that had escaped during the earlier chaos. He performed a frantic, ungraceful pirouette, his arms flailing before he finally regained his balance, accidentally slapping a stern expression back onto his face while holding a single, lonely shrimp puff. The police chief blinked, his hand hovering over his holster in confusion. The mafia guards looked at their shoes, trying desperately to maintain their professional masks. Rosen, who had been clutching her shirt in distress only moments ago, felt a sudden, involuntary huff of air escape her nose. It was a laugh, small, sharp, and entirely inappropriate for a crime scene. "Han," Kwang said, his voice dropping an octave, though a glint of genuine amusement sparkled in his dark brown eyes. "Did the ham put up a fight?" "Mission accomplished, boss." "The kitchen is secure," Han squeaked, trying to tuck the shrimp puff into his blazer pocket with a look of intense, somber focus. The absurdity of the moment broke the Vane family's remaining dignity. The patriarch sputtered, realizing he was being dismantled by a man whose deadly organization included a clumsy assistant with a snack problem. The laughter warmed the cold room, and for the first time, Rosen didn't feel like a maid or a victim. She looked at Kwang and saw that his stern and intense persona was a suit he wore for the world, but not necessarily for her. As the laughter subsided, Kwang's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, his expression instantly returning to its sharp, side-parted precision. "It seems our guest of honor has arrived," Kwang said, turning toward the grand staircase. "And he isn't here for the shrimp." From the top of the stairs, a shadow blocked the light. The detained man wasn't the only one involved. A second fair-skinned man, the one who actually held the family's true debts, was looking down at them with a very real, very loaded expression. The laughter from Han's clumsy entrance died instantly as a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Standing there was Arthur Vane, the patriarch and owner of the mansion. His fair skin, usually hidden behind layers of expensive cologne and artificial smiles, was now ashen. He clutched the mahogany railing so hard his knuckles turned white. "Kwang Liu," Arthur called out, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. "You come into my home, you use your security to hijack my gala, and you humiliate my family? We had an agreement." Kwang didn't look up immediately. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the foyer, his dark brown eyes finally lifting to meet the owner's gaze. The stern and intense expression from the thumbnail was now at full force. Our agreement, Arthur, was that I would protect the Star of the Orient until the auction. Our agreement did not include you hiring your own nephew to steal the diamond so you could claim the insurance money and pay off your debts to the Soul Syndicate. The room went cold. Rosen looked from the powerful man beside her to the crumbling billionaire on the stairs. She realized then that the real thief wasn't just the man in handcuffs, it was the man who signed her paychecks. You can't prove that, Arthur hissed, though he didn't move. Kwang gestured to the detained man being held by his guards. Your nephew has a very loud mouth when he's scared, Arthur. And my men are very good at listening. He turned his gaze back to the jewelry box in his hand. The diamond stays with me. As for the theft, the police chief here is very interested in insurance fraud. Arthur Vane looked at Rosen, his eyes narrowing with a venomous heat. You're taking the word of a maid? A girl who scrubs my toilets? Rosen didn't flinch this time. She stepped out from behind Kwang's shadow, her textured updo still perfect despite the chaos. I don't just scrub your toilets, Mr. Vane, she said, her voice clear and resonant. I also translate your international bank statements. I know exactly which accounts you've been draining. Kwang's brow arched in genuine surprise. He looked at Rosen with a new level of respect. He hadn't known she had been tracking the finances. It seems, Kwang said, turning back to Arthur, that you underestimated the invisible help. Arthur let out a guttural sound of defeat, collapsing onto the top step as the police moved toward him. The owner of the mansion was now just another suspect in a very long line of crimes. Kwang turned to Rosen, his hand extended. It seems your moral rigidity comes with a very sharp mind, Rosen Gold. I believe we have one more matter to settle before the sun rises. He led her toward the door, but as they reached the threshold, Rosen stopped. She looked back at the grand, hollow house she had spent months cleaning. What happens to the house? She asked. Kwang smiled, a real, dangerous smile. By tomorrow? I expect I'll own the deed. The interior of Kwang Liu's sedan was a silent vault of black leather and the scent of expensive sandalwood. As the gates of the Vane Estate vanished into the mist behind them, the adrenaline that had sustained Rosen began to ebb, leaving her hands trembling in her lap. Kwang sat beside her, his silhouette sharp against the passing streetlights. He didn't speak until they were well away from the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers. You mentioned his bank statements, Kwang said, his voice low and devoid of its earlier edge. A maid shouldn't have been able to read those. Arthur Vane is a man who locks his doors. Rosen leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. He locks his doors, but he doesn't hide his trash, she admitted, her voice weary. He assumed because I wore a uniform, I was illiterate. For months, I'd been emptying his shredder bin in the study. He didn't realize that a linguistics major can piece together a jigsaw puzzle of bank headers in 5 different languages. I saw the wire transfers to the Soul Syndicate. I saw the overdrawn notices he tried to hide. Kwang turned to look at her, his dark brown eyes reflecting a new level of intrigue. You took a massive risk. If he had caught you piecing those together. I was already a ghost to him, Rosen interrupted, her chin lifting with that characteristic moral rigidity. And ghosts see everything. I wasn't looking for dirt, I was looking for a reason why my paycheck was 3 days late every month while he was buying $1,000 bottles of wine. Kwang reached into the pocket of his blazer and pulled out a sleek, obsidian-colored tablet. He tapped the screen and handed it to her. Rosen's breath hitched. It was a digital receipt for a wire transfer, not to a syndicate, but to the Ethelgard General Hospital. Her mother's entire balance, a debt that had felt like a mountain, now read 0. Consider that a bonus for the intelligence you just provided, Kwang said. He didn't wait for her to thank him, knowing her pride might make it difficult. But the hospital is just the beginning. I am moving my operations into the Vane's old territories. I need someone who understands the languages of this town, both the ones spoken in ballrooms and the ones hidden in the trash. You want me to be a spy? Rosen asked, a small, wary smile touching her lips. I want you to be my chief of intelligence, Kwang corrected, his expression turning serious and stern once more. The Vane Estate will be seized by the bank by noon tomorrow. I intend to buy it. And I would like you to return there, not to scrub the floors, but to run the house. Just as Rosen began to process the magnitude of the offer, the car suddenly lurched to a halt. The driver, one of the stoic guards from the gala, muttered a quick apology in Korean. Through the windshield, Rosen saw a familiar figure standing in the middle of the rain-slicked road. It was the fair-skinned nephew, somehow free of his restraints, looking frantic and holding a heavy iron tire iron. The iron tire iron clattered to the wet asphalt before the nephew could even swing it. Kwang's guards moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency, disarming the man before he could breathe a word of his desperate threats. Rosen watched through the tinted window, her heart racing, but she felt a strange, new calm. The ghost of the Vane mansion was gone, she was now under the protection of the only man in Ethelgard who truly saw her. Kwang Liu didn't even look out at the scuffle. His attention remained fixed on Rosen. The interior of the car felt smaller now, the air charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the heist. My offer still stands, Rosen Gold, he said, his voice a low, resonant anchor. The Vane Estate will need someone to oversee its transition. Someone who knows where the secrets are hidden. I am looking for an equal, someone who can speak the languages I cannot. Rosen looked at his hand, resting near hers on the leather seat. She thought of her linguistics textbooks, the ones currently sitting in a locker at the university, waiting for her to finish a shift that had turned into a nightmare. She thought of the exams she had been mentally preparing for while polishing silver. I'm still a student, Mr. Liu, she said, her voice steady and full of that characteristic pride. I have a linguistics exam on Monday, and I don't intend to miss it. I took this job to survive, but I'm not leaving my education behind. A rare, genuine smile broke across Kwang's stern features, a look of quiet, possessive pride. He liked that she wasn't just accepting a handout, she was maintaining her boundaries. I didn't ask you to quit school, Rosen, Kwang replied, his thumb grazing the raw, scrubbed skin of her knuckles in a gentle, lingering touch. I'm asking you to use what you're learning. From now on, you won't be studying by candlelight in a servant's quarters. You'll have a desk in my office and a driver to make sure you're never late for a lecture again. Rosen felt the weight of her old life, the buckets, the ruffles, the silence, finally fall away. She was no longer a part-time maid struggling to be a full-time student. She was a woman whose brilliance had finally been recognized by the most powerful man in the city. Then we have a deal, she said, her dark eyes meeting his with a newfound confidence. As the car pulled away, leaving the ruins of the Vane family legacy in the rearview mirror, Rosen Gold realized she wasn't just escaping a cage. She was stepping into a kingdom where her voice finally mattered. The mist of Ethelgard began to lift, revealing the first light of a new day, and a woman who was finally done cleaning up after other people's secrets.